Good afternoon, viewers. I'm going to make a quick disclaimer to save myself from grief. This is an alternative opinion, an alternative view of SLS versus Starship that I personally do not subscribe to. From the beginning, when I created this channel, I've always believed that Starship, that the idea of reusability, that refueling in low Earth orbit has been and always will be the best and most efficient way to explore the solar system. We're not going to be able to colonize the solar system until we actually have things like fuel depots and fully reusable rockets. All of that having been said, though, recently I've started to ask myself, are my views, and the views of all the rest of us, really tainted by the fact that NASA just doesn't have the budget that it had during the Apollo era? Keep in mind that NASA's current budget is 8% of what it was during the time of Apollo. In today's dollars, if NASA received the same funding as it did back then, it would be over $300 billion. And by the way, that's still a fraction of the U.S. military budget, just by way of comparison. And all of that being the case, if you launched an SLS every single week with that kind of budget, even paying $4 billion per launch, you could easily support that. A weekly launch of SLS, 52 weeks a year, and still have a ton of money left over. So the question we're going to ask in this video, if money is no object, if we take money out of the equation, is Starship really any better than SLS? Good afternoon. Once again, welcome to an unusual episode of The Angry Astronaut, where I'm going to depart from a long-held opinion that I've had pretty much since I established this channel. I have never believed in SLS or the concept of wasteful, expensive, expendable rockets. I've never been a fan of that. I'm still not really a fan of that. But recently, I've had to ask myself a number of questions, especially in the aftermath of the rather unimpressive performance of the two CLPS missions that we've had up to this point. Now, what we've tried to do in both of those missions is land on the moon for a little more than $100 million per contract. That's actually less than we spend to resupply the ISS. I'm going to say that again. We spent less on each of these missions to land a payload on the moon than we spend to resupply a space station in low Earth orbit a few hundred kilometers up, as opposed to hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. Are we just getting too cheap about all of this? And if we had the kind of budget that we had during the time of Apollo, would that change everything? Would we really have anything to complain about? Would SLS be a sustainable system that would allow us to set up a long-term presence on the moon if we had that kind of money to throw at the program? Well, even if we did, isn't Starship a whole lot better just because it's a lot less expensive, being 100% reusable as opposed to almost 100% expendable, the only reusable part of SLS being the Orion? I mean, doesn't that just make Starship a hell of a lot better? Well, maybe, and maybe not. We're going to examine all of that right now. Now, please stay tuned to the end of this video where I'm going to roll out a contest that I tried to roll out a week or so ago, and Teespring went and sabotaged everything I was working on. But let's get on to the topic at hand. Misconception number 1. Starship can take far more payload to the moon than SLS can. This is true if you refuel Starship in low Earth orbit. But if you don't, SLS's capabilities are far superior to Starship. Even the Block 1, the version that they're using right now, can carry 27 metric tons all the way out to the moon. Starship can only carry 25 metric tons out to geosynchronous transfer orbit. GTO, we're not talking about a direct drop-off in geosynchronous orbit, and Starship's capabilities of delivering payload all the way to the moon on a single tank of fuel are pretty pathetic. There's some question as to whether or not it could deliver any payload at all. And this gets more and more pronounced the later you get in SLS's development. For example, the Block 1B will be able to deliver 38 metric tons to the moon, or 42 metric tons in cargo version. And then when you get all the way up to the Block 2, you're talking 43 metric tons or 46 metric tons with cargo version. Now, how can this be possible? Starship has far more thrust at its disposal than SLS does, even on the second stage. So how is it that Starship is not capable of delivering more mass out to the moon? Well, it's because SLS is comprised of extremely lightweight, advanced composites that are made up of this honeycomb-like structure that make them very strong and yet very lightweight all at the same time. I got an opportunity to see these composites while I was at the Dynetics facility in Huntsville, Alabama, because they're building the universal stage adapter for the Block 1B of SLS. It's actually pretty impressive. Whereas Starship, as we all know, is made of stainless steel. And stainless steel may be tough, it may be cheap, and it may be easy to work with, but it is not light at all. Meaning that the dry weight of Starship is so much heavier than SLS that even with that much more thrust, with 33 Raptor engines on the first stage and 6 Raptor engines on the second stage, the rocket has almost completely burned through all of its available fuel by the time it gets to low Earth orbit, whereas SLS has more than enough fuel to push a considerable amount of weight out to the moon without any refueling. Another factor is the reusability of Starship itself. The booster has to keep a fair amount of propellant and oxidizer in reserve in order to bring it back to the launch pad. SLS, being expendable, doesn't have to do that and can utilize every drop of fuel getting its payload out to the moon, improving the amount of mass that it can deliver all the way out to that very distant destination. So expendability may suck as far as cost, as far as wastefulness is concerned, but as far as delivering the maximum amount of payload with one rocket out to the moon, SLS definitely has the edge. Now, what about misconception number 2? Efficiency. Starship is way more efficient than SLS because using an expendable rocket, as we all know, is like using an airliner to fly from New York to San Francisco and then throwing that airliner away once you arrive at the airport. Whereas using Starship is like using the same airliner over and over again, which is why air travel is affordable these days and space travel is not. Well, I'm afraid I'm about to attack that misconception because using Starship is not exactly like using a regular airliner. It is instead like flying from New York to San Francisco and having to conduct 10 aerial refuelings before you reach San Francisco. Yeah, that's right. 10. Now granted, those 10 aerial refuelings are actually filling up a fuel depot and not filling up the airliner itself, so you're actually only having to carry out a single refueling between New York and San Francisco, but the fact remains that you have to fly Starship 10 times to refuel it sufficiently in order to get it all the way out to the moon. It's not really the same thing as using a plain old commercial airliner. Not the most fair comparison at all, actually. And will Starship be able to maintain the necessary cadence and reliability and reusability to conduct that many refueling missions to get to the moon? And also, how about propellant boil-off? How much is going to be lost out in space, because propellant does have a tendency to do that during these 10 refueling missions? Are you actually going to have to carry out 11 or 12 or perhaps even more? Whereas SLS is a much simpler operation. One rocket, one arrival in lunar orbit. And there are other factors that make SLS a more efficient solution for the moon. For example, the exploration upper stage, which is going to replace the ICPS. It's equipped with 4 RL-10 engines instead of a single RL-10, giving it a lot more thrust and a lot more payload capacity. But here's the most important advantage. There's no reason that the exploration upper stage cannot be refueled in lunar orbit. What does that mean? Well, the RL-10 engines run off of liquid hydrogen, not off of methalox the way that the Raptors do. Methane is almost unknown on the lunar surface. We found very little evidence to suggest that there are significant deposits of methane anywhere on the moon. That being the case, then, in situ resource utilization is much, much better for the exploration upper stage on the SLS than it is for Starship, meaning that this upper stage, together with Orion, could explore a vast number of destinations in a single mission as long as it can be refueled in lunar orbit. A big advantage for the long-term exploration and colonization of the solar system. Well, okay, that may be so, says the Starship enthusiast, but here's the biggest advantage of all. SLS can't even land on the moon. It can only get to lunar orbit. Starship can do the entire job. It can lift off with crew members on board, or it will be able to, at some point in the future, take those crew members all the way out to the moon. Yeah, it'll require some refueling to do that, but it'll be able to do it, and then land on the surface of the moon, and then bring those astronauts back home. SLS can't do that, right? Well, actually, it kind of can. Or at least the later versions of SLS can, or rather could, if NASA was actually planning for it, which they've decided not to for one reason or another. You see, the later versions of SLS, the Block 1B and others, have this thing called a Universal Stage Adapter. It's actually an additional payload bay that can carry a lot of additional cargo, including a lunar lander. It's more than big enough to carry something about the size of the original Apollo LEM. As a matter of fact, it could carry something substantially bigger than the Apollo LEM, like, for example, the Dynetics Alpaca. Now, to be fair, if you put the Alpaca inside the Universal Stage Adapter, it will not be able to carry enough fuel to get down to the moon and return to lunar orbit. It will have to have one refueling mission in lunar orbit in order to be able to carry out the job. But that's one refueling mission, not 10. And it can get even simpler if you use Boeing for the entire equation, as Boeing originally proposed with what they called the fewest steps to the moon, a lunar lander that was capable of being carried inside the Universal Stage Adapter in conjunction with the Orion capsule, meaning that if Boeing had been allowed to handle the entire mission, in theory, they could have done everything with a single launch of SLS. So why didn't NASA at least consider that possibility? Well, because the original manager for the HLS program, Doug Lavero, for reasons that are a little difficult to figure out, but I have theories about that. Doug Lavero gave unfair competitive information to Boeing during the HLS selection process. Doug Lavero was forced to leave the organization in disgrace, and Boeing was removed as a competitor for HLS. If Doug Lavero had not done that, if he had exercised just a little bit of common integrity in this entire process, Boeing might very well be one of the HLS solutions right now and not SpaceX or Blue Origin. However, of course, that didn't happen, for better or for worse. So why did Doug do that? Well, because at the time, NASA was trying to get human beings on the surface of the moon by 2024, and Doug Lavero knew damn well that the only way that that could possibly happen is if he had a system that was completely integratable with the SLS and something that could be delivered to the moon in a single launch, rather than all of these refueling missions that would take way longer than 2024 to develop. Keep in mind, once again, it was NASA's commitment at the time to put humans on the surface of the moon by 2024. Boeing was the only one who, theoretically anyway, could pull that off. We all know, of course, that they couldn't have done it, but they were the ones who, from an engineering perspective, had the slightest chance of pulling it off. So really, where is the advantage that Starship brings to the table, at least when we're talking about going to the moon? It takes a lot more missions, it can't really make use of the in-situ resources at the lunar South Pole the way the SLS can, and it also doesn't have the same kind of flexibility. Is it really all about price? Well, of course, there are many other factors about SLS that make it very unattractive indeed. It's gone way over budget. It's been woefully mismanaged. So many problems that I've already talked about in previous videos, there's no sense in rehashing them here. But if SLS were actually properly managed, if they had somebody aside from Boeing making sure that things actually went right with the development process, if it was something other than the Senate launch system, could it actually be a viable solution for maintaining a permanent presence on the surface of the moon? Well, with NASA's current budget, probably not. Only $26 billion a year, the paltry amount that Congress doles out to NASA. There's no way you're going to be able to sustain a permanent presence on the moon if you're paying $4 billion a pop for SLS missions. But as I said before, if SLS had the budget that Apollo had back in the 1960s and 70s, you could actually transport 100 human beings and 1,550 tons worth of cargo and supplies out to the moon every single year, which would be more than enough to sustain a very substantial lunar base with a lot more personnel than the International Space Station, if NASA just had the same budget that it had back in the old days. And yeah, if you had the same budget and used Starship, in theory, you could deliver a whole lot more than that. But then again, you have to launch Starship so many more times than you have to launch SLS, so would it really end up being any more payload? If you only launch 50 rockets a year, only 5 of those rockets are actually going to reach the moon if you're using Starship, because the other launches are being used to refuel the rockets that are headed there. So really, is Starship that much better than SLS? Well, we're probably never going to find out, because Congress is never going to give NASA the kind of budget they need to sustain SLS. But for a while at least, SLS is going to be an important part of Artemis if we are to reach the moon in anything resembling a reasonable time frame, so I guess we need to get used to it. But how do you feel? Do you think that Starship is really the best solution? Or are you a big orange rocket fan? Well, we're going to find out over the course of the next month and a half, because I've got 2 new pieces of merchandise, and man, they are awesome. Having been created by the incredible digital artist Nick Henning, we have the SLS, Earth to the Moon on 1 tank of fuel, and Starship, because, as we all know, size matters. Between now and the end of April, Whichever team buys the most merch will have a special video made just for them about special applications that their favorite rocket could be used for. Because yes, there's even some unusual missions that SLS could be used for that are pretty damned amazing if you'd like to check that out. And of course, Starship has all kinds of applications for the future that could change the destiny of the human species. So good luck to both teams, and by the way, once the contest is over, one lucky competitor will be awarded a special shirt, a Rocket Lab Neutron shirt, also created by Nick Henning, a one-of-a-kind item that only that one winner will get. And also, just to let you know, I don't sell a hell of a lot of merchandise on this channel, so if you do buy yourself a shirt, your odds of winning that prize are actually pretty damn good. Good luck once again to all of you. Please like, please subscribe, and as always, stay angry about space.